At the end of the First World War in 1918, and with the breakup of the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires, new nations would emerge in Eastern Europe, including the newly independent nations of Poland and the Baltic states. But the borders of these new nations were not immediately clear, and disputes over the borders of these new countries would lead to conflict between each of these new states, as well as with the newly formed and resurgent Soviet Union, which by 1920 had completed its victory in the Russian Civil War in the east and the south of Russia, and was now ready to redirect its attention to the west. The withdrawal of German forces at the end of the First World War left no clear boundary between the new Polish state and the Soviet Union, and border clashes between the two would eventually escalate into a full-scale Polish-Soviet war around the year 1919, as Poland wanted to secure its eastern borders, while the Soviets wanted to spread their communist revolution and to help the new communist movements in Germany and Hungary by going west through Poland. However, Soviet forces were spread very thin, as the Soviets were at this time also fighting the other newly independent nations in Eastern Europe, and were still fighting the end stage of the Russian Civil War. In the confused fighting, the Polish forces actually performed very well. The Poles were able to advance eastward and even take the Ukrainian city of Kiev. But as the Soviets stabilized their situation, they were able to bring their superior numbers to bear and recapture the city, before advancing into Poland itself. Before long, the Soviet Red Army was deep in the heart of Poland, even threatening to take the Polish capital of Warsaw. The continued existence of the Polish state was under threat. However, while the Soviets had the advantage in overall numbers, they had also outstretched themselves during the course of their advance, having split their armies into three groups, one in the north trying to reach the Polish-German border, while one in the south, with Joseph Stalin as its political commissar, was trying to capture the city of Lviv, in what is now Ukraine. This left the Soviets attacking Warsaw vulnerable, and meant that the Poles might be able to organize a counterattack. As part of this planned counterattack, the Poles had an important decision to make. The Soviets were using open radio channels to communicate between the various armies, so the Poles had a choice. Should they leave these radio signals open so they could listen to Soviet transmissions and track the movements of Soviet troops, or should they block these transmissions to cause confusion in the Soviet ranks? Eventually, the Poles decided that blocking the signals would be the more useful option. The Poles would do this by transmitting their own Morse code radio messages on the same frequency as the Soviets. But these signals couldn't just be gibberish, since then the Soviets could just learn to tune it out. What the Poles needed was something coherent that they could transmit whilst also being long enough that different radio operators taking over from each other after each shift could transmit uninterrupted and without repetition. And of course, there was one obvious choice. Catholic Poland would use the Bible to fight against what they saw as the red tide of atheist communism. The Bible was easily long enough to be transmitted without interruption over the course of many days, and its easy availability to radio operators made it the ideal choice to jam Soviet transmissions. The confusion caused by the jammed signals, as well as the secrecy of the operation and the outstretched Soviet lines, allowed the Poles to smash into Soviet forces and threaten them with encirclement. The Soviets were soundly defeated at the Battle of Warsaw, or as some call it, the Miracle on the Vistula. The Soviets were forced to totally withdraw from Polish territory, and for the time being, Poland had secured its independence from the Soviet Union. But this was not the last time religion in Poland would be used to counter the Soviet Union. After the Second World War, Poland would be forcibly incorporated into the Soviet sphere of influence as a communist satellite state, and at the time, it seemed that Poland was doomed to remain forever unfree and under the control of a foreign power. Things started to change for Poland in 1978, when Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyła was elected to become Pope, as Pope John Paul II, becoming the first ever Slavic Pope of the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul would make frequent visits to his native Poland, and these visits would often become unofficial rallies for Polish anti-Soviet opposition. And while Poland would not become totally free from the Soviet Union until 1989, many of the opposition movements drew their early inspiration from the words and actions of John Paul II. This is just another example of how during Poland's turbulent and difficult journey through the 20th century, religion played a key role in the maintenance of Polish identity, in ways big and small, both at home and on the battlefield. I hope you enjoyed this video and thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more from Newsreel History and help more content get made, please consider subscribing and I'll see you next time.